Like I said, what we're going to do is, so we've 5 panelists here. I'm going to ask them an opening question just to get them warmed up and get them started. But just so you can have an idea of what their background is and what their, I suppose, area of expertise is, so you know what type of question to put their way. So there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end when everyone's spoken. So I'm going to go first to Donal. And Donal is on our steering group. We're very lucky to have him on our steering group. He's a catchment scientist and a hydrogeologist. He's worked for most of his career with the GSI, the Geological Survey of Ireland, and then in the EPA. He's semi-retired, but he's still very active, supporting projects like this and giving training to low pro staff and other people as well in catchment science. So Donal recently wrote a paper, a briefing note or a paper on drained peat soils, and it's obviously very relevant to FarmPEAT and farmers on peat soils. So I suppose, Donal, if you could explain to us like what motivated you, first of all, to write this paper and maybe summarise the main key messages for us.
Thanks, Caroline, and good morning. I suppose one of the things that motivated me is my own background. So for the first 18 years of my life, I lived in West Offaly on a farm near a place called Ballycumber. I don't know whether any of you know it. And a third of the farm was cut over peat, cut over bog, reclaimed by my father. And an area in the 1950s. And I worked on it, tilling it with horses at the time. And one of the things I had to do was go down and dig up docks when I was 9 or 10. And if anybody are familiar with that horrible job. And I have numerous relations in Offaly then who were farmers and dairy farmers, beef farmers, and with quite a bit of peat, owned quite a bit of peaty soils. Now earlier this year, as you know, re-wetting was a controversial topic in the Midlands. And there seemed to be a lot of antagonism, reading the Farmers' Journal, listening to the radio. And I felt that at the time that was understandable because there's fears of the economic impacts. Because as you know yourselves, peaty soils are productive for farmers. So I knew that obviously from my own experience. And so I could understand it. But at the time I felt that the explanations for re-wetting and the messaging of those advocating re-wetting was poor. And one factor not mentioned, I felt at the time, is that drained peaty soils overlying peat with a water table, a maintained water table, tens of centimetres, maybe over a metre below ground level, will result in the subsidence of the peat and the inevitable and eventual reduction in the productivity of those soils. And really, ultimately, you could get the loss of those soils completely. And I'll explain why in a minute. So I felt that message wasn't coming across, and I felt that was an important message for farmers, for my relations, for instance, who were farmers as well. And at the time I wrote down the title of a note that I hoped to write at some stage at the time, and I called it "Drained Peaty Soils Are a Wasting Asset for Farmers." Now, somebody who read the briefing note commented to me back rightly, I probably should call it a disappearing asset for farmers, and that's the case. And I'll explain why. You know yourselves, peat is formed in waterlogged conditions. Peat contains a lot of water. It's over 90% water by volume. There's more water in peat than in milk, if you think about it that way. Or another way I like to think of it, any of you would have all walked across a relatively intact raised bog. Well, that's the closest you'll ever come to walking on water. And that's one way of looking at it. Okay, so what happens when you drain the peat, when you lower the water table? It subsides. And it subsides by two main mechanisms. One is by shrinkage, as the water is lost from the peat and it dries out. And back again as a teenager, I would have cut peat with the slan, with my father, for instance, and saved it. And you know yourself the size of a sod when you cut it. It's quite large. By the time you've saved it, on into August, you'll have noticed that it'll be a lot smaller. And if you come back a year later, a couple of years later, again, the same sod would probably be only half the size as it was when it was cut. So in other words, it shrinks. That's one thing that peat does. But the other thing it does is that it wastes away and it disappears up in the air, essentially. And I'll come back to that. I'll just give two examples of this. There's a famous example over in England called the Holland Fen Post. And back in 1851, there was an exhibition in London, a famous exhibition in London. But they took some of the pillars, the metal pillars from that, and they put it down, drove them down into the peat of the fen in East Anglia. And then they cut off the top of the pillar at ground level. So there was 6.7 meters of peat at the time. So, and they drove it down into the underlying clay. Due to successive stages of drainage, originally using windmills and then using diesel pumps, the pillar is now 4 meters above ground level. So sticking up above ground level. In other words, the fen peat has subsided by around 3 centimeters a year. And the area of peatlands, it's a very productive area. It's tillage, mainly tillage is used for. And the area of peatlands in the fens of East Anglia are now less than half of what they were 400 years ago. So in other words, the peat has just wasted away or disappeared. The other example I give is Clara Bog. And if you're familiar with Clara Bog, a road going across it there, back originally 200 years ago, that was one dome. Then a road was constructed, and over the years, there was drains on each side, or on one side in particular. And so that's subsided by up to 8 meters since then. If anybody you're in the middle of Clara Bog, in the middle of that road, and look at the car park there, look at the, I don't know, it was telegraph or ESB post, I can't remember which. The bog would once have been above the top of that post. So that's just to give you an idea of what happens. Okay, where does the peat go then? That is, I suppose, is the questions. What happens when it's drained? Well, the water obviously drains off into watercourses. But the other critical thing that happens is soil microorganisms get into the peat because it's aerated, and essentially they eat the peat. And so it gives water then, as one of the carbon dioxide, which goes up in the air, nitrous oxide, which again goes up in the air, and dissolved organic carbon, and ammonium goes off in the water. So essentially when the water table is lowered, it wastes away or disappears in that way. And the deeper the drains and the deeper the water table, the greater the subsidence, the oxidation and the wastage. Again, as you know yourselves, and you probably hear more of this from Bernard, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide are greenhouse gas emissions, and are contributing to our warming, and essentially, you could argue, to the flooding, etc., the heavy rainfall we have. The ammonium then goes into the watercourses. And I noticed back when I was working with a couple of people in the audience here, when you saw look at the chemistry of a watercourse as it went through a bog, a drain bog, you see the ammonium levels rising, and above the limits that it needed to be at, for instance. So in other words, it causes pollution. So there are significant downsides from the draining of the peat. So it seems to me there's three issues then. On the one hand, farm peaty soils are an important asset for farmers. And I saw that at home. I remember back originally we grew carrots, seed potatoes, but mainly used for grass, and good grassland, as you'd be familiar with yourselves. On the other hand, the drained peat is causing environmental problems, causing environmental pollution. And in addition then, and this is the point I want to emphasize, they waste away and are disappearing once you drain them. And they're not a long-term asset. They're an asset, yes, but they're not a long-term asset. Okay, it may take decades. I'll give you an example. My parents then moved to East Offaly to a land commission farm then in the 1970s. And my father, there wasn't nearly as much peatland on that, but there was some. So again, my father drained it and converted it into leveled it, converted it to good soils, really good grassland over the years. But what's happening now is it's gone slightly uneven in places because of subsidence, differential subsidence, because although it's fairly thin peat, less than 2 meters, the underlying subsoil would bit up and down, so the deeper peat would subside more than the shallow peat. What's happening is the tree trunks are starting to come through the grass now, and it can't be used for silage ground anymore unless those are removed. because obviously you can't, with them coming through, affect the soil aerator. So in other words, that peat is wasting away gradually, probably a few millimetres per year, gradually. And eventually it'll subside until the water table is only maybe 10, 20 centimetres from the surface, lowering the productivity of the land for the farmers. So to finish off then, looking to the future then, as I see it, there's three options. Keep the water table tens of centimetres below ground level, maybe a metre ground, around 80 centimetres a metre, and let it waste away gradually. That's essentially what's going to happen to the peat. It'll just waste away or disappear gradually. Second option is to re-wet it. In other words, bring it up to the water table. Bring the water table up to the surface. And that's sort of what's happening in Borden and Warner, for instance, are doing. And the third option I want to mention to you is to raise the water table to within, say, 30 centimetres of the surface, to reduce and slow down the wastage while still allowing farming to continue in a reasonably productive manner. So that's what I'm suggesting I think farmers need to do as a minimum on this. Otherwise, the peat is just going to waste away reasonably rapidly. And I think it's in the farmer's own interest to do this. So option 3 then has the additional co-benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and water pollution. And my suggestion then would be for farmers to do this, but I think farmers, in my view anyway, need to be paid properly for the environmental benefits that would result, the reduced greenhouse gas emissions and the reduced water pollution, based on how high the water table is raised. Maybe it could be raised to the surface. Some farmers would be happy with that, but get paid for the amount that the water table is raised. And the last thing I would like to see is the negative atmosphere needs to change. And I know this word, for some people, re-wetting, people worry about that word. And I would prefer to start calling it raising the water table management, or something like that. So try and get a more positive approach to it. Caroline, you have that briefing note. If anybody wants to read it, you can get it from Caroline.
Thanks, Donal. Yeah, the briefing note, actually, we have it on our website, so if anyone is interested in reading the paper, it's on our website to download. So thanks, Donal, for that. That's a great summary of it. And I think there's another example of the peat disappearing at is it the Port Arlington roundabout? There was, or Port Leash roundabout on the motorway.
The sculpture of peat. I don't know if you remember anybody who travelled the bypass, Port Leash bypass. That this lovely sculpture of studs of really nicely built up. And I noticed, I forgot to take photographs of it at the time, but I noticed over the years it gradually started to get smaller and crumble down, and eventually it was just a small heap of sods of turf there, and eventually it was gone. So it just wasted away, disappeared.
Thanks, Donal. But the reason I bring it up is I have a photograph of it, so I'll put it up on the screen later, just so you know what it's in relation to. Okay, so I know there's probably questions on that, so please hold them and just make a note, and we can come back to Donal afterwards with questions. Bernard, I'm going to move on to you next. So Bernard is a scientific officer in the EPA. He's one of the lead authors of the NIR reports, the National Inventory Reports for Ireland, which report on Ireland's emissions. And he has special responsibility for agriculture and land use change and forestry sectors. So again, very relevant, and Bernard also sits on our steering group. So Bernard, the most recent NIR, which was published this year, reporting from 1990 to 2021. So we know from that the LULUCF, that's the land use change and forestry sector, is a net emitter in Ireland, which is unusual in Europe, emitting about 7 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So largely due to the drainage of peat soils for grassland or for peat extraction. Excuse me. So as I said, it's unusual. In most other EU countries, this sector is a net sink, but in Ireland, it's a net emitter. So I suppose my first question is, can you break it down a little bit in terms of the 7 million tonnes? So you've got your industrial harvested peat and you have your grasslands, just to give us an idea of the proportionality there, I suppose, between the two, and maybe explain a little why we're so different to Europe. And then also just a little bit about what we know about the amount of emissions now coming from our drained grasslands on peat. And I suppose that we're all well aware of the recent report from Tagus. There was a recent paper giving us an alternative estimate of the area of drained grasslands on peat. So we've been mentioning the 335,000 hectares of drained grasslands on peat, and Tagus have come up with some other figures. So if you could comment on those, that would be wonderful. I'm going to bring this over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. For starters, LULUCF stands for land use change and forestry. And within LULUCF, you've forestry, croplands, grasslands, wetlands, settlements and other lands. And essentially what we're doing there is we're estimating CO2, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane loss from soil. Within the EU, there's only 2 countries that are net emitters from the LULUCF sector, ourselves and Denmark. And in our case, the cause of that is the drainage of peaty soils, whether for industrial exploitation or for agricultural purposes. I suppose just to give rough figures in terms of the grasslands piece, you know, we've 4.2 million hectares of grassland, farm grassland in Ireland. About 3.8 million hectares of that is mineral soil. The other 300,000, as Caroline was saying, is peaty soil. For that peaty soil to be used for agriculture, it had some form of human intervention, whether it was drained, whether it was boundary drains, whether it was infield drains, etc. So something had to be done to change that from a bog to something productive. So when you look at the grasslands of their own, that 3.8 million hectares of mineral soil is sequestering somewhere in the region of about 2 million tonnes of CO2 annually. In comparison, the 300,000 hectares, circa 300,000 hectares of grasslands and peaty soils are actually emitting, our current estimates would suggest around 9 million tonnes of CO2 annually. So you can see the effect there of 300,000 hectares emitting 9, grasslands and mineral soils sequestering 2. So overall, for grasslands, there's about 7 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent emitted. Now, when we were trying to develop our inventory estimates, and irrespective of what sector it is, whether it's land, whether it's agriculture, whether it's power generation, whether it's road transport, we are solely dependent on data from other agencies. We're dependent on statistics from the CSO, or dependent on energy statistics from the SEAI, land area statistics from the Department of Agriculture, research results from Tagus. And I suppose the paper that Caroline referred to there is something that we have been asking for a large number of years, is try and get a better handle on the drainage extent of the peatlands under agriculture in Ireland. And what that paper actually did was unearthed historical information that was there and had been forgotten about almost. So what it does is it changes our outlook, because if you don't know, you have to estimate the worst. But the one thing I will say about it is that it still does not change that area of grasslands on peat soils. That still remains. That 300,000 hectares still remains. What it does do is it gives us more information about the management of those peat soils, and gives us a very good starting point historically from the work that was done by Galvin and others back in the 80s. What it doesn't do, and as part of our current discussions, is trying to capture the extent of drainage that has occurred since the late 80s and early 90s. But I just want to make one thing clear about drainage, is that when we're estimating emissions at a national scale, or indeed if you want to bring it down to the local scale as well. Drainage is only part of the calculation. It's only one part of how you look at this. So we also need to know the nutrient status of the peat. Is it nutrient poor? Is it nutrient rich? And we also need to try and get some handle on whether the drains are deep or whether they are shallow, because all of those three have an effect on how much emission is going to happen from the degradation of the peat in the first place. But the one thing we do know, and just to reiterate what Donald said, is about the one thing we know for certain is by increasing or bringing the water table up, you're at least going to reduce that degradation or that shrinkage of the peat in the longer term. And I suppose I would echo what Donald said as well, because I'm familiar with the post that he's talking about, just to see that differential in the peat loss over the last 150 years on that site. It is really, really stark.
Thanks, Bernard. Okay, so that's great just to get that, I suppose, clarity. And the NIR reports are all available for downloading as well. So if you're interested in reading up the nitty-gritty detail, we'll move on to Hugh. Bernard, I'm sure there'll be questions, but we'll come back to that. Hugh is an associate with RPS Consultants. He works as a hydrologist and hydrogeologist. He gave a lot of support to the Living Bog project when they were installing dams and restoring the high bog. So he's now moved out to the edges with us and given us a lot of support and advice in terms of water and installing dams and where it's going to go, etc., and levels. So it's been very valuable to us for the FarmPEAT project. So I suppose, Hugh, from your perspective, what would you see, what is the role of someone like yourself with a lot of expertise in hydrology and hydrogeology for a project like this? So, as we're saying, there will be other projects like this and other schemes down the line. So what would you see as the importance of that input? Thank you.
So thanks, Caroline. I really see a hydrologist's role being balanced in the likes of this. So I suppose there is the real credible, it's been in the media about flooding and the negative impacts of re-wetting, and look, that is a real worry, and in cases where it's done wrong or done incorrectly, blocking of drains on agricultural land can lead to flooding of your own farm and farms upstream adjacent. These are negative impacts that are there. On the other side of the fence, it's not going to be cost effective, it's not going to be practical to get a hydrologist involved in every single decision about whether a drain should be blocked up and down the country. If this project gets expanded out to be a more national project, it's not going to be cost effective for a hydrologist to get involved and assess everything. So for me, we have to find the sort of middle ground where we're using the likes of this project as a stepping stone to develop maybe a protocol or a way of assessing these drains. So it's a farmer-led project. I believe that the initial steps for those sort of easier drains, the ones that aren't going to result in flooding, should be blocked by the farmers, and a protocol set in place that we can identify those. Maybe moving on to a different phase where we've identified drains where some remedial works or investigations are required for that confidence, that we can block this without having an impact. But the situation is that there is drains out there that are going to be quite difficult to block, just due to the topography of the Midlands. It is quite flat, the nature of drains and how they were installed. There is going to be drains where it is going to be complicated, and that's where I see a hydrologist role coming in, and it's advising for those more complicated drains. I think it's been touched on by our two previous speakers. Something that we also have in our arsenal here is that we don't have to just block a drain and flood a field. We can look at levels, we can look at flows coming off the bog, we can look at the flows coming off agricultural land, and design a system in place that increases that water table to an extent that it still allows farming, but it reduces the emissions that are emitted from that particular piece of land. Secondly, I think there's some really good graphics shown earlier on about the peat dams and the plastic dams. Those technologies have really been optimized for, as Caroline mentioned, the high bog or the cutover bog. So these are technologies that have been improved over decades, really, from, if you look at some of the very early restoration techniques. These techniques have been adopted and improved, and we've learned lessons from various projects, and I suppose we're now at a sort of situation that we're very confident that they're going to work for us on the high bog. As we step out into the agricultural sort of land, we're faced with different problems. So we've the type of underlying subsoil presents a challenge and things like that. So one of the roles that I think a hydrologist or a hydrologist could advise on is optimization of maybe new technologies, working with the farmers. Farmers know their land better than anybody. One of our first go-to whenever we come onto site is to engage with the farmers, because I could spend a week walking a site and I'll still not have half the knowledge that the local farming community would have. So I believe there's a role there to work with the local community to optimise the measures we put in place to block the drains. And the final point I would just touch on is just one of the lessons that we've learned from previous projects is that where we make real ground is when you have all the disciplines pulling in the same direction. So when you have ecologists, when you have guys looking into the greenhouse gas emissions, hydrologists, farmers, all pulling together, all sharing information, that's where the real progress is made. So I see a project like this, it is a stepping stone, it's a learning curve, and I think hydrology input should be one element of that we consider to sort of move the whole thing forward, really.
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, I have to say when we're telling new groups about the FarmPEAT project, it's often the hydrology that we get questioned on. So I'm sure there's going to be questions for you in a while. Jonathan, we'll move on to you. So Jonathan is our FarmPEAT participant farmer, and he was also involved in the Living Bog project as well. He's farming organically with his wife Mags in Clara, and he has given us, he's, as I mentioned earlier, he sat on our steering group for a year, and he gave us, great input, great perspective, just to get another farmer's perspective on the project and the things that we were doing. So he's been great value to the project, and he's up here now again, to his delight. So Jonathan, I suppose in terms of all the information, like we've heard a lot of science this morning, and I suppose we're just curious to know what you think in terms of that information. Is it being communicated to farmers, to the farming community? If it is being communicated, do you think it's being communicated effectively? And if it's not, do you think there's any way we could improve that communication? And I'll just put this question to you now so I don't have to move the mic again. But when you're finished that one, you might just think a little bit about the supporting actions that you've undertaken as part of the FarmPEAT project, and just tell us a little bit how that went for you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Jonathan. Right, what was the first one again? Oh yes, the science. Is it being communicated well to farmers? Yes, here in the room, yes, because we've the privilege of these learned people, and Jim Ryan down in the audience as well. I certainly got my eyes opened when I came onto the steering group, and I think most people here in the room are on the same page because they've heard from these people at least once before. But in the wider community, I'd have to say no. It's a case of them and us, because they haven't been. There's a certain amount of scaremongering going on about re-wetting, and it's people get very emotional about their lands because it's how they derive their income, and and rightly so. And if you're trying to reduce someone's income, or anyone would be mad over it. But I'm not sure how to put this. People. If we work together, people aren't looking to flood people's land. People are looking just to raise the water table slightly and see how it goes, because this is, in this group, it's done from the ground up, and if it doesn't work, you can stop. And that's important, and I think it's important for the future, because I can see this in 5 years or 10 years' time, it shall become mainstream with the Department of Agriculture. It shall be part of the new GLOS or ACRES or whatever scheme it's going to be. And the Department of Agriculture tend to be one size fits all, and it's what you call it. It won't work in this regard. One size will not fit all, and that's what. And I can understand the fear with farmers in that regard, because it will have to be done at a local level, which will cost money because it will require boots on the ground. Okay, my supporting actions was sort of a measure of how good a farmer I was, because I had about 5 acres of high gorse on the farm. So my supporting action was to remove that, because the gorse was considered an invasive species, which I thought was counterintuitive to nature and fauna and everything. But anyhow, so what you call it? I'm an organic farmer that Caroline happened to mention, so I purchased myself a flail mower, which I happened to get a grant on, and the supporting action was the payment, which I still haven't received, by the way. Well, effectively, by the end of the year, if I ever get my payment, I'll have a free flail mower. With the way the rules have changed now, we're not allowed to burn anything. So flailing is something which is going to become more common.
Thanks, Jonathan. So yeah, but just to clarify, so we don't encourage, wide-scale removal of vegetation, but when it's on peat soil, it is taking up the water from the peat, and it's not allowing the native vegetation to grow there. So it's all linked to the water, really, isn't it, and the peat. Thanks, Jonathan. So Philip, last but not least, Philip works with the Department of Agriculture. He's in the Climate Change and Biodiversity Division, focusing on land use policy and with an emphasis on peat soils. So again, hugely relevant here. Philip also sits on our steering group and has been great in sharing his experience and linking us, I suppose, with other colleagues in the department as well, which is hugely important for a project like this. So, Philip, I suppose we're after hearing from Jonathan, a farmer, and there's lots of farmers in the room, and I'm sure the question on lots of their lips is, what's coming next? So, FarmPEAT is a pilot project, but we know there are plans in the department for other schemes, policies, projects, etc. So, I know it's not all in your remit, but if you could just give us an idea of what you know about what's coming next for the farmers here, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Caroline, and morning, everyone. So I suppose the overview, I'll give you a quick rundown of all the policies that's there at the moment, and some that have changed recently and some that are going to change and evolving over the next number of years. So I suppose to start with, going back to the Climate Action Plan 2019, and where the emphasis has been on the peat soils, and in that Climate Action Plan there was a target to hit 40,000 hectares of reduced management intensity of drained organic soils. And as part of the Climate Action Plan, there's an annual update, so a reiteration every year. And in the 21 plan, this target was raised to 80,000 hectares. And last year there was the CAP 2023, which maintains that target. And there's another update in 2024, early next year. So highly likely that 80,000 hectares target will be maintained. So that's where I suppose this EIP project came from initially, was to try and focus on that and how we achieve that. And I think there's a lot of knowledge gaps in terms of where we start with that, what we have at the moment, and what we need to do to get there to reduce. So the question is, how do we reduce the emissions from these peat soils? The CAP strategic plan is one element of that, I suppose, that will help contribute to it. It was the start of this year, it came into force. Most of you will know in terms of the BIS and other acres schemes that has come in. Part of that is the GAIAC, the Good Agricultural and Environmental Conditions. There's a GAIAC 2, part of the conditionality requirement, formerly cross-compliance. And the requirement around that is that the EU require Ireland to have a peatland map on the LIPIS system, so the Land Parcel Identification System, and that's required nationally. That's been worked on to incorporate that into our Land Parcel Identification System, and as part of GAIAC 2, there's requirements to, I suppose, protect peat. So likely that there will be a status Q1 that to try have some conditions, but that hasn't been worked out. During negotiations with the Commission at the moment to see what's involved in that, and the aim for that will be coming in. GAIAC 2 will be finalised next year. Moving on then to the nature restoration law. Most would have heard about this already. It's currently in the trilogues, in working through the discussions between trying to get agreement on it between Council, the Parliament, European Parliament, and the Commission. And there's, I suppose, the relevant condition, or the article within that is Article 9, and it's looking for, I suppose, re-wetting or restoration targets on peat soils by targets by 2030, 2040, and 2050. These have been revised down and they've been taken out, so whether they will be brought back in depends in how the discussions go. But I think that was the nature restoration law was quite it was recognised in the discussions, and part of that, I suppose, is that it'll be a national law and not an individual law. So it's required at the national level and not at the individual level. So I think that's an important aspect to that those discussions. And then moving on, there's also moving in at an earlier stage in negotiations at Council that there's a carbon certification regulation being discussed at the moment. And what that is it's looking to develop, I suppose, at EU level, the rules around the voluntary carbon market, and how not just farmers but other areas in terms of industrial, how you can reduce emissions, or mostly around carbon removal. So how you capture that, how it's measured and credited, and how it's I suppose traded on a voluntary carbon market. So that's been developed at the moment. The regulation itself outlines the broad kind of objectives, but then there will be there'll be methodologies developed at a later stage between the Commission and experts into what exactly a farmer has to do, or how it's measured, and how the verification and certification part of that can be independently verified and then traded on the open market in terms of a voluntary market that might be brought into place. So I suppose the department are involved in that at the moment. We're monitoring it, but there's also in terms of carbon farming an action within the Climate Action Plan that we actually develop a national farming framework. So that's in development at the moment. There was a public consultation put out in middle of September, I think, so should be coming to a close soon. And that is looking to develop a framework around carbon farming, so how we develop schemes, and how we contribute to a voluntary market. It's, I suppose, going back to the carbon regulation, the focus is on carbon removals in terms of how you increase sequestration, whether it's improving the soil carbon in your mineral soil, or whether it's planting trees or planting hedgerows, or maintaining hedgerows in such a way that it improves sequestration. But there's also an allowance for reductions of emissions in your peat soil. So if you're re-wetting or lowering the water table, that potentially, or that will be something that once the verification methods become improve, that it will be part of a trading, that you'll be able to certify and trade on the open market, on the voluntary carbon market. So that framework's in development at the moment, and that'll be in place hopefully early next year. And then going back to, I suppose, what's happening to actually achieve our 80,000 hectares in terms of, there's a Midlands carbon catchment study that we've applied and been supported in terms of the Just Transition Fund of 15 million that's been put towards a project that will look at reducing the emissions from peat soils in the Just Transition territory. So that's the Midlands, parts of the Midlands area mostly, and then parts of Kildare and North Tipperary as well. So it's a defined region, which we will be included here in this area. And that is, it'll be, I suppose, kind of a continuation of the EIP style approach. So it won't be defining what you have to do or defining how. There won't be hard and fast rules from the very outset. It's a research project, so similar enough to how the FarmPEAT project has worked. It will be looking to develop ways of reducing the management intensity and how you actually incentivize farmers to take action to improve, I suppose, the sustainable management of these peat soils. So that's in train, that's coming down the line. These projects, FarmPEAT has been extended for another year, so it's hoped that this project will be a continuation on, or will be a more long-term commitment to farmers to reduce the emissions from peat soils. So that's we've just got approval for that project from the Commission last week, so we'll be hoping to put out a call by the end of the year or very early next year, and hopefully that'll be up and running to give I suppose a good indication of where we're going in terms of incentivizing farmers to reduce emissions. And then I just want to mention at the end, I suppose, in terms of, there's a lot of knowledge gaps in this area, and this is where FarmPEAT comes into it. Where, you know, it's working with farmers on the ground to see what can be done, but there's also knowledge gaps in terms of our data, in terms of soil mapping. So Caroline mentioned it at the start, in terms of you look at your farm, the green land cover map is there, and once you take soil testing on the farm, there's some are peat soils and some that are mineral soils are actually peat soils. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of having better maps. So we've invested in mapping projects, and then there's also in terms of getting a better read for Bernard in terms of reporting emissions, and that goes back to the investment in the flux towers. So the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, where there's in the last number of years there's going to be a monitoring network of about 30 flux towers, and there'll be a number of them on peat soil. So there will be a lot of change coming in terms of how we understand the emissions and the areas in terms of the emissions from peat soil. So, and I think there's a buffer zone, I think, and Hugh mentioned this, and it's been mentioned before, in terms of where we need to get to in terms of, is there a buffer in terms of the agricultural production, which is the main aim of you're producing crops or livestock for sale, that is there a buffer there that the emissions are higher than they should be to produce that? So can we take actions to reduce emissions, raising the water table to a certain level that can actually maintain your production, maintain your income as is, but actually increase your income because you're now wetting and taking actions to reduce your emissions. So I think there's potential there, that there is maybe a buffer, that the production can be maintained, but the actual emissions can be reduced as well. So there's some potential there that I think projects like FarmPEAT and the Midlands Carbon Catchment will improve, or that's the objective anyway. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Philip. And I'm pretty sure there's your colleagues are in the room, like Michelle Carney is here as well, and Jerome Walsh and Bernard Harris. So feel free to add at the next stage, if there's anything you want to add there to that. But That's a good overview. I suppose maybe just one more question before we open it up to the floor. I suppose Philip or for Michelle or Jerome or Bernard in the room, just the farmers that are in the FarmPEAT project and the Farm Carbon project as well. I think Doug is here as well, and like we're obviously very concerned and hopeful that the farmers who are undertaking actions in these projects to I suppose reduce their emissions from peat soils, like is that going to be of benefit to them in the longer run with all these other schemes and projects coming down the line? Maybe that's something you can comment on. Yep.
Yeah, so I think that goes back to what's been developed in the FarmPEAT project is results based. So you have your scorecard. So the scorecard that was developed here was taken on in terms of the acres projects, the corporation and the main scheme one in terms of your low input permanent pasture. That is results based. So you have a scorecard, and that was taken from the FarmPEAT project. So it's likely that if you improve, the more you improve, the more you're going to improve your score on the scorecard and the increase in your payments. And I think so. I suppose the early movers won't be will still get paid more, even though they've done more earlier on. And then the earlier you have it, the payments from annually will be maintained if the scorecard remains high. So I think as part of the Midlands carbon catchment as well, it'll be a continuation of kind of the main objectives in the FarmPEAT. So you will be using that scorecard, but then trying to develop, and part of the Midlands carbon catchment is we want to try bring in the carbon farming aspect of it. So what's happening in the certification framework, is there potential to, I suppose, pay on a results base from using a scorecard, but is there also potential to take additional actions which will result in additional credits that can be used to either trade or get additional payments from maybe private finance or outside finance that originally wasn't there. So I definitely think there's the results based scorecard is the foundation for all the work going forward.
Thanks, Philip. Katie and John, do we have another mic for people in the room if they have questions, or will we just ask them to stand up and speak out loud? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions from everyone in the room. If anyone has a question, maybe you could just stand up and say your name, and you can address the question to anyone on the panel. So are there any questions from anyone? We should have given you a cup of coffee beforehand, maybe. Lovely.
My name is Jeff from Clara. I just want to ask the man from there, or is this scheme unique to Ireland, or any other countries in the EU that are doing FarmPEAT pilot schemes? So, you know, depending on what the EU Commission there, you know, they're based on all their funding on that. Or one compared to other countries.
To my knowledge, I'm not sure there's one that's very similar. There's, I suppose it's other member states with high peat soils, Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, that there would be projects ongoing and a lot of national funding that has been aimed, like ourselves, in terms of recognising that there's a high amount of emissions from these soils. But there is differences. So in Germany, you would have different problems. They have polders, which they have the peat has receded, and they've banked up the soil so that the ground level is actually lower than the surrounding water in areas, and similar enough to the Netherlands. So they have control over the water table, so they have bigger areas to deal with. So I suppose they're looking at different ways, and the same in the Netherlands. They have smaller plots, and again the water level is at a higher area around it. So there is other schemes, but in Europe, but that would be similar enough, but not to my knowledge in terms of EIPs. Some of the EIPs that are already there in terms of the upland areas in Ireland. But I suppose there is schemes. We're involved in I think University of Galway of FarmPEAT, where there's a number of different countries involved, more in terms of bog restoration rather than actual agricultural peat soil. So I suppose there's different projects, but not as that you can make a direct comparison to the. So I think we're kind of pioneering the approach here, because it's not a copy and paste of a project. You can say, oh, they've done it here in the Netherlands or in Scotland or any other country that we can. It's easy just to say, well, this is a good way to follow. I think what we're doing here is kind of a pioneering approach to reducing the emissions.
Thanks, Philip. Any other questions?
Here again, yes, program. Just an obvious question, I'm sure it's been asked before. Where there's two farmers share a drainage channel, and it's generally the main channel that's leaving the farm is shared, the boundary farm. How do we get over the obstacle of where one farmer wishes to remanage the water table and the neighbour doesn't do that? So whether it's an actual scheme or a local scheme, how do we get over that?
I suppose the only point I could add, maybe I can pass the microphone over, is just like at the minute, you're right, like we wouldn't be proposing blocking of those channels. Some of the farms that we've visited so far, we've tried to come up with alternative solutions based on the data that we have, topography, how we could maybe block some of the feeder drains. But you're right, like at the minute there isn't a procedure in place, because we can't put forward recommendations that are going to have impact on farmers that aren't signed up to the scheme. So any of the recommendations, as I say, we've been putting forward have been internally within farms that are signed up to FarmPEAT itself. But it is something that's going to be have to be looked at as the process gets rolled out, maybe nationally, because it is a problem that's just going to keep coming up and up again. If anybody else wants to add.
Yeah, Kieran, it's a very relevant question, and obviously we were aware of it when we started the project. Like the ideal situation is that you have a group of farmers, that are in the project, and they're all neighbouring farmers, and then you have more, I suppose, scope to work with those boundary drains. So what we did was, in the event that we came up with, again, as to a situation where we had a farmer who was willing to do some water table management on his farm, and there were neighbouring farmers that weren't in the scheme that were going to be impacted. So we have a system in place, but we haven't had to test it yet, whereby we would approach the neighbouring landowners, explain the situation to them, and see what their reaction is. We would propose some kind of financial incentive to allow the work to be done, or alternatively, if they said, look, we'd be happy if that was going to happen, but as long as a certain area of my land wasn't impacted, then we go back to you and see what could be done. Was there any options there to adjust the levels that we had proposed originally, reduce them down so that that land wasn't going to be impacted? But as I say, yeah, just the lands that have come up in the project to re-wet or manage the water table, so far we haven't had to do that yet. So I have no idea if that will work or not, is my point. But that's what we've come up with so far.
I'll just make a quick comment. I think that the farmer that doesn't want to participate in it, if it's explained to that farmer that by keeping the water table down, say a metre down or whatever it is, 700-800 centimetres, that he's eventually going to lose the peat, then it might encourage that person, him or her, to start to think about joining in. What seems to me that is missing a little bit, now maybe I'm wrong on this, so I'll just make it as a comment, is that the explanation about the fact that you do get peat wastage, I'm not sure that has been made sufficiently to farmers, and maybe that would encourage some to at least participate to some degree.
Thanks, Donal. Any further questions?
Catherine? Yeah, I was just, suppose I have to put my hand up and say I'm on the steering group of FarmPEAT. And so just congratulate the team on the great work. And I suppose, like Donald, I was quite concerned with all the negative communications around the nature restoration law and this use of the term re-wetting. So I worked in Board and Mona for a number of years and was quite used to, trying to dispel this belief that the blocking of the drains would negatively impact on lands around. So I think one of the key things really is about how do we communicate all the benefits that come with this kind of work. So there's benefits, and we've heard a lot about carbon, which is really important, and it's a real driver of policy. Water, I'm not sure that the benefits are communicated clearly as well. And I think particularly from a biodiversity perspective. So, a lot of the work that Philip outlined there, were working with the Midlands carbon capture and recent work here in FarmPEAT, that's going to have a lot of benefits for biodiversity too. And even the work in Ballydangan, which has, it's very local to us here. The benefits there for curlew, species with, less than 100 pairs breeding in the country, that work there has had an enormous benefit there. So I suppose I'm wondering, from Philip's perspective, the synergies for biodiversity between the work on raising the water level, and I agree re-wetting is an awful term, that is recognised, but there's also potential payments for farmers. It's very linked in with nature restoration targets, biodiversity action plan, so not just the payment for carbon, but then payments for species like lapwing, which used to be much more abundant in the landscape. So that would be the first thing that we need to be cognizant that it's not just for carbon. But then, and it comes back to where I started, how do we communicate better about these benefits? And it's not something to be afraid of. And to me, when the debate was going on with on the media, it was highly polarised, and I felt that the media were doing a lot to generate a lot of the animosity between different groups. And Caroline did a great job in coming on some of the radio programs to talk about it. So we need to make an absolute effort to engage with groups like IHFA, IFA, ICNSA, because if they want to know. And from my own work, working with farmers in Connemara, Mayo and Donegal, they're wondering what's going on and what's this going to mean for us. But even like today, having a reasonable, open conversation about things, and it's not something to be done. So there's two elements there. Was aligning the different initiatives and policy targets, from biodiversity, carbon and water, and then making a concerted effort to communicate great work here, like in this scenario here. So just comments really, but welcome to responses.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I think the benefit with the peat soils is that if you are raising the water table or re-wetting, that there is the co-benefits are there in terms of the biodiversity and the water quality and the attenuation, and there's a recognition, okay, especially with what's happening in Europe with the carbon certification regulation, that they are trying to build in the co-benefits as well. So when the focus is carbon, so you get a carbon credit, but it also, if there's a carbon credit with a high amount of co-benefits, if there's positives for biodiversity or water, that carbon credit will be worth more than what one with maybe minimal effects on biodiversity or water. So they're building that in, and potentially there will be more money for, or more a higher price for that carbon credit. That also goes back to, I suppose, in terms of reducing your emissions on the livestock emissions as well. If there's as part of that carbon removal or soil emission reductions, that there'll be co-benefits. So they're trying that's being built in as well. But then there's also potential around that there is that focus on carbon and maybe looking at eco credits as well. And I think that goes maybe goes back to actually valuing valuing the biodiversity that's already there, and giving that a kind of a value in the accounting system as well. So and then just I suppose in communication, yeah, I fully agree. I think there was I think the Commission would admit themselves that the communication just wasn't up to par in terms of the nature restoration law, especially. So I think projects, especially like this, it aims to, because there is a lot of question marks over emissions, where the soils are, how they're managed. I think projects like this and the work they're doing in terms of Love Your Wellies competitions, it's invaluable to getting, I suppose, the correct understanding or an awareness that's correct, at least as a starting point to go forward, I think.
So any other questions? Yep, Kieran.
Just to clarify, where you envisage the payment for remanaging the water table going forward, is it solely going to be based on the results based in terms of biodiversity, or I would hope that there would be a large part of it as well built into the carbon and water quality element? Because it's been said here already that the biodiversity status period is trying to improve. So if you're waiting for time, that's not going to bring farmers on board. The biodiversity part of it really should be the icing on the cake. It shouldn't be the whole thing.
Is that in really, who's that for, Kieran? Is it?
Well, I suppose it's the department.
Okay, we have someone else from the department there, do we, Bernard?
I suppose, look at Philip has outlined where we are at an EU level for a carbon removal certification framework. I suppose that's the 2030. There are registries to be developed for 2030. There are guidelines around methodologies such as, for example, additionality, the question around permanence, for example. But I suppose funding is who's going to pay is the question is coming up here, and we still don't know who's going to pay. Like, unfortunately, the state's resources are limited. We know that. This project is obviously funded through an EIP program, and it's time bound, as you know, over a certain period of time. So what we need to look at is potentially where is this funding going to come from. Now, we're told there's a lot of private funding out there, whether it be at a world level or a EU level, that can be tapped into. But I suppose the one in relation to what can be funded, the CRCF has identified, as Philip has said, obviously carbon is central to it, but the co-benefits, we know emission reductions, for example, can be included as a national framework, but there are other things that could be included, such as biodiversity. Now, we haven't all the answers, we know that, right? But all we can do over the next number of months is to develop the framework, put a framework in place whereby at least we can give certainty to farmers, build guidance at a national level, at least we build a basic understanding for farmers, for example, what is meant by carbon farming, for example, but at an industry level that this is the same meaning that is taken by everybody. So look at this is going to be a different process over the next number of months, and we're working towards, as Philip said, the end of Q1 24 for this to be developed. And hopefully we'll have more answers then. It certainly won't be the finished article, we know that, but it will be a starting point.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. So, Michelle Barnes is a colleague of and Philip, so I'll be looking at it and have responsibility for the EIPs. And I suppose just to say, in terms of the policy context, that we were very conscious that it was important to extend both the EIPs, and I know they're represented as CW volume today, in terms of maintaining that momentum and trying to work towards that 80,000 target. But to build on Bernard's point, we have to bridge the gap between we can't wait for a carbon farming model to come into place. So we do have the Midlands Climate Action Study, that we will be launching hopefully by the end of this year. We've said that's worth 15 million to just transition territory. So that's a phenomenal amount of money that we can build on then to actually attract further private investment. If our people about that there is a need for long-term certainty here. So re-wetting and those type of activities should not be, and we will be very supportive of cap cycles or anything like that. They are very much long-term activities. So what we're hoping to do is that the Midlands Carbon Catchment Study will give that foundation, will give that certainty to farmers then, and as it is a results-based or also a research-based project, that it will actually try and test carbon farming models as well, so that you can bring in the private money. So then you can actually pay for actions over a 10-year period. So it's not just for 12 months, it's not for 2 years. So we hope collectively that that will be launched by the end of this year, and we will encourage obviously then people to participate. And we see both FarmPEAT and FarmCarbon then as that bridging mechanism, I think, to maintain the momentum within the territory here, and that's what the Commission calls it, in terms of regretting or reduced management intensity.
Thanks, Michelle. Doug had a comment as well, yeah?
Doug McMillan, I'll be managing the other EIP that Michelle spoke about from Carbon and that Caroline mentioned. Just to answer the question specifically, I think the scorecard-based system is easier to measure the biodiversity than it is the carbon emissions. That's essentially based on average water table in the field, and as you will tell you, that's not particularly straightforward. So until there's more straightforward mechanisms for doing that, or cheaper technologies, then that's probably not going to be available. And the same thing on the water side of things. It's, I think later on, Philip was talking about what's going on in different countries. There's also different codes, and they're based on the vegetation or they're based on the water level. And they are talking about these additional ecosystem services of water quality, water storage, and all the, minimizing water pollution. But so far it's all been on the carbon, but again, that's not particularly straightforward. So I don't know if that helps in terms of the answer.
Thanks, Doug. Jeff, sorry, you had a question?
I was listening to Midlands Radio 3 on the way down here, and Will Faulkner had an article on the project that's going on in Offaly, and I didn't get details. That is in the Irish Times today. There's an article about it, and people are mentioning private funding here. There's a pretty big building firm. I want to mention them because I'm not sure if it's there or not, but their name was mentioned, and they're going to fund that project. So I think there is an opportunity to get big industries involved in this as well, because they want to kind of have an opportunity to buy carbon credits as well, big industries. So it's worth looking into trying to get private funding from them to fund it too. So, and that article might be worth looking into. It's an area of grassland they want to plant a certain type of grass that suits the peat, and there's a major root system on it as well. So it supports the peat and stops erosion of the peat. So it's been funded by this building firm anyway. So it is worth looking into the private funding.
Thanks, Jeff. So did I see another hand? Oh yeah, Bernie.
Just on a practical level, we farm about 50 acres over near Dangan, 30 acres of which is peatland. Normally we can do traditional hay meadow, and we would have maybe had an income of about €5,000 from that last year. That is not there this year. We did not get hay after the 31st of July. We managed to get 60 poor quality bales the first week. We haven't re-wetted. It has just come naturally. The land was saturated beyond anything we had seen, since there was some drainage work done back in probably the 1970s. But since that, we've never seen the level of water that we've seen this year. And I can't see how going forward that we can sustain that level of loss. So I'm not sure how we can sustainably farm peatland with the weather we've had this year. So if that is going to continue, we're going to actually look at some other model farming. So we also have very extensive grazing rather than intensive.
Thanks, Bernie. Yeah, I suppose I might just make a brief comment on that, maybe, and then if anyone else wants to comment on it. So it's, yeah, this year has been very hard for farmers all across the board. And I suppose in a way, like the way I would see that then is that it is reinforcing kind of why we're doing what we're doing. Because actually Bernie sent me on an article there recently, and I forget who wrote it, but it was a kind of a scientific review of the weather from over the years, and it was the first time that, you know, we all say, oh, there's a lot of rain this year, it must be climate change, but this time it was actually scientifically, not proving it, but in a scientific way, saying that, yeah, the weather we're getting now, you know, we are in climate change. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. We're trying to reduce it. It doesn't help your situation. I know, I appreciate that at the moment, but and I suppose the other side of it is when you're talking about raised bogs in particular, you know, the wetter they are, they're able to function properly then, and what they do is they slow the flow of water. They regulate that so that you have a reduced risk of flooding down the line, downstream. And obviously then they're reducing emissions as well at the same time. I don't know if anyone else has a comment on that to add, or anyone else in the room.
Well, it is just that there's a lot of research going on, very valuable research, but, you know, I'm not sure it's a disconnect between communications. I think it's more the theory and the practice, how they meet, how you actually get the academic side of it to a practical farmer in the field, you know what I mean, that end. But I think that has to come a bit closer.
Yeah, so I'd just say maybe that's what this gentleman was referring to, the project we're doing. So I think it was already mentioned that if you bring the water to 30, 40 centimetres below, you should be kind of business as usual. But then what we were looking at with FarmPEAT was when you go beyond that, how do we keep the production? So we're doing the experiment with mixes of grasses and legumes that will hopefully maintain that production. And also just the fourth option, which wasn't mentioned in terms of management of peatlands. Okay, it's not for everybody, but it's wetland agriculture. There are a lot of other crops that you can grow that we're looking at. So again, that would be a minority, but there is a fourth option. But the obvious one is that we, you know, if you keep the water table, get the water table higher, and then maintain the yield of grass, then that's what we think is going to be key. And particularly for the more intensive grass, and maybe the more extensive, it's not going to be so.
Okay, we're going to have to call it there.